Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Cuddy from the Chicago Humanities Festival, and I'm so happy to be welcoming you to tonight's program with Adam Hochschild and Monika Bauerlein. Adam is a writer, historian, journalist. Monika is the CEO of Mother Jones, and they'll be talking about Adam's new fascinating book, Rebel Cinderella, From Rags to Riches to Radical, the epic journey of Rose Pastor Stokes. So looking forward to that, the story of a Gilded Age, turn of the 20th century activist whose story has a lot of resonance for us right now. So this is kind of a reunion of sort for Adam and Monika. They were on CHF stages back in 2012. So we're excited to welcome them both back. And we've been doing these kind of conversations for a long time now, more than 30 years. And we really believe our core value is that coming together like this, talking about ideas, exchanging experiences, is not only a great cultural experience, it's an important civic element of life. You know, it's a key to the health of our public life and to the strength of our democracy. So if you feel that way as well, we hope you'll think about supporting us. You can go to chicagohumanities.org to find out how to make a donation or to become or to renew your membership or find other ways to participate at the festival. And you can also check out all the great programming we'll be doing in the coming weeks. Next week, we'll have Tori Amos, another kind of Rebel Cinderella with her book, Resistance. And then Eric Kleinenberg will be kicking off a series looking at Chicago and how we're responding to the pandemic, both historically and in our current moment. And we'll be talking to some artists and activists from the Englewood neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. So I hope you'll come back for those programs. As for tonight, I hope you're going to participate. Feel free to ask questions. You can pose them in the chat channel on YouTube. And toward the end of the program, Monika and Adam will try to answer as many as possible. So the plan for tonight is that Adam's going to come out and give a short talk about his work and share some visuals. And then Monika will join him and they'll have a conversation, and then we'll go to Q&A from you. And another way you can support the program tonight is by buying Adam's book. So it's out in paperback. If that's possible for you, we encourage you to go to our partner bookseller, Seminary Co-op. They are an independent bookstore on the south side of Chicago. So you can do two good deeds in one, buy the book and support independent book selling. That's a really great thing to do right now. So I think that's about it from me. Thank you to our captioner for making this program accessible. Thanks to Adam and Monika for being here. Thanks especially to Mother Jones for being our partner on this program. And thanks to all of you for being here. And now let's give a warm virtual welcome to the wonderful Adam Hochschild.
Well, thank you very much, Allison. It's good to be here with you. I have been with you in person, in the flesh, at the Chicago Humanities Festival twice, I think. And now this is the first time virtually. And let's hope it's the last time virtually, because I hope by this time next year we will be well past this virus thing. Anyway, it's a pleasure to have the chance to talk to you about my new book. It's most of the book is about the woman in this picture, Rose Pastor Stokes, a remarkable and forgotten figure. But it's also the story of her very unusual marriage. And I think it's a marriage which offers a window, in a way, onto life in this country a little more than a century ago, its hopes, its illusions, its enormous injustices. The woman who would become Rose Pastor Stokes was born in Tsarist Russia, in this town. When she was 11 years old, she and her divorced mother came to the United States in 1890, like so many millions of people on a packed immigrant ship like this one. They went to Cleveland, Ohio, and as soon as they arrived there, Rose immediately had to go to work in a factory making cigars. This is the first picture in which she appears with her fellow cigar workers. She's the middle figure in the back row at the age of 16 in 1896. She did this work for a dozen years. By the end of that time, she was supporting herself, her mother, and 6 younger siblings who had been abandoned by a ne'er-do-well stepfather. She earned about $8 a week, which is equal to about $240 today. Very little on which to support a family of that size. When Rose was about 21, she saw something which really changed her life. It was a copy of a Yiddish language newspaper published in New York that was trying to go national, the Yiddisches Tageblatt, or Jewish Daily News. And the paper invited contributions from readers around the country. So she began sending stories, anecdotes, poetry from Cleveland, was astonished to find that the paper began publishing it and even paid her when they published something. 2 years later, when she was 23, in 1903, the newspaper invited her to come to New York and work at its office there, at double the salary she was making as a cigar worker. And this is what New York City looked like at the time that Rose arrived there. New York City at that time is a city that would have terrified Donald Trump because it was a city of immigrants. More than half the men over 21 in Manhattan, for example, were foreign born. This is the Lower East Side where Rose lived and worked. The people like the peddlers in this picture, or people who worked in the shop behind them, these were the sort of folks that she interviewed and wrote about for the newspaper. But one day in the summer of 1903, about 6 months before she'd arrived in the city, the editor gave her a different kind of assignment, which was to go and interview a volunteer from outside the neighborhood who was working at a Lower East Side settlement house. Here's the man she was assigned to interview, a volunteer at this settlement house, James Graham Phelps Stokes, called Graham by his friends. As you can tell from the name, he was Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He and Rose fell in love. Now, Graham came from the most different kind of background imaginable. Here, for example, is his family's summer home. When it was built in the 1890s in the Berkshire Mountains of Western Massachusetts, it was the largest private home in the United States, 100 rooms. Here are Graham's parents. Each came from large fortunes, which they combined when they married. Part of their money came from the Phelps Dodge mining empire, part from New York real estate, especially luxury apartments on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Some of it came from a cluster of gold and silver mines in Nevada and a railroad that led to them, and from more sources as well. But Graham followed a different path in life than his brothers and sisters. He went to medical school at Columbia University in New York. And working on a horse-drawn ambulance while he was a medical student, he was exposed to a very different New York than the one he'd grown up in. This was the New York of the tenements. He was shocked by what he saw. Immigrants living packed 6, 7, 8 people to a room, for instance. People living in tenements where often the only toilets were outdoor outhouses like these. And it was seeing conditions like this that led him to join the settlement house movement. He and Rose courted secretly for 2 years, and then finally the news of their engagement leaked out. And it received immense attention. Newspapers all across the United States, in Europe and Australia, reported this most unusual marriage. This, for instance, is the page 1 headline from the New York Times. Here is their engagement as the lead story on the front page of the New York Evening World. And as you can see from the headlines, what attracted attention was not just that it was a marriage of someone extremely rich with someone extremely poor, but it was a marriage between Jew and Gentile. Very, very unusual for that time. Finally, despite the well-concealed dismay of Graham's family, they married on July 18th, 1905, Rose's 26th birthday. Graham was 7 years older, and the press remained fascinated by them, and they lived in a blaze of publicity for years. The core of the public's fascination was that here there seemed to be the Cinderella story. Prince Charming coming and rescuing poor virtuous Cinderella from her humble hearth and bringing her to live in his castle. And of course, anybody reading that story hopes that love will conquer all the differences between them. However, their lives did not exactly fit the Cinderella script, because Graham, to some degree, had left the castle, and Rose had no desire to live in one. Although they often stayed at one of the several houses of his parents, it always made her uncomfortable. She and Graham were both acutely conscious that they lived in a country with enormous disparities of wealth. Some people lived in great splendor, as Graham's family did. Others were desperately poor. The year after they married, in 1906, they both joined the group that they felt was best likely to solve these problems of disparities of wealth, social justice, the Socialist Party. Rose continued her journalism, but now it was about issues of labor and social justice that she wrote. About 4 years after they married, the United States was convulsed by a wave of strikes, which lasted really about a decade, with hundreds of thousands of workers walking out every year. One big strike of garment workers was in New York City. And you can see, if you can read the signs in this picture, they're in 4 different languages: English, Italian, Yiddish, and Russian. Rose was heavily involved in this strike, speaking to groups of strikers often many times each day. And it was really in this big New York garment workers strike, beginning in 1909, that she came into her own as a labor organizer and as an immensely popular speaker. She was soon recognized as one of the great radical orators of her time, and she began to eclipse her husband in the attention that the press paid to them. And gradually, the ongoing cascade of newspaper stories were more about her than about them as a couple. And there are signs that he was not happy about. The most colorful strike Rose got involved in was of hotel and restaurant workers in New York City in 1912. She was on the strike committee. She addressed many rallies of striking waiters. She wrote and spoke about the miserable conditions in which many of them worked. And in her papers, there are many, many letters of thanks from waiters. One of the hotels whose restaurants were struck in that strike was the Ansonia Hotel on Broadway between 73rd and 74th Street in New York. The building is still there today. And its owner was Graham's uncle, William Earl Dodge Stokes, or Uncle Will, as they called him. He was a passionate hater of labor unions, immigrants, and much else. And he was absolutely furious that his own nephew's wife was encouraging his own workers to go on strike. Let me turn to another aspect of Rose's and Graham's lives. One of the things that made them so fascinating for me to write about was their friends. They knew and worked with the most interesting collection of people in the United States in that era. Here's Rose with Eugene Debs, the 5-time socialist candidate for president, on the left. Behind them is Max Eastman, editor of the magazine The Masses, the best magazine in the country at that time, really in many ways a precursor of the New Yorker. They were also friends with Big Bill Haywood, the leader of the Wobblies, the Industrial Workers of the World, the country's most militant labor union, a former miner, cowboy, saloon card dealer, a charismatic orator famous for using his fists when necessary and for being able to recite long passages of Shakespeare by heart. They were friends with John Reid, probably the finest journalist of his generation, with Lincoln Steffens, the great muckraker, with W.E.B. Du Bois, the greatest Black intellectual of his time, with Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones, the labor organizer after whom Mother Jones magazine is named. Rose and Graham knew all of these people and many more as well. And the time in which they lived was a time of tremendous optimism, a belief that the world could be changed and that a new and more just society would soon come into being. Then something happened that dashed those hopes: the First World War. 1914. Now, of course, when the war began, the United States was not involved, and American socialists and other radicals agitated very strongly for the US to stay out of the war. Rose and many other friends joined something called the Women's Peace Party, which staged demonstrations like this one. Finally, however, in the spring of 1917, American troops began going to France. The US declared war on Germany, and soon there were huge numbers of Americans in Europe. Here at home, the country was swept by fervor for war and by ferocious government propaganda, like this US Army enlistment poster. Many radicals still felt strongly that the war was a huge mistake, but they were harassed or arrested when they spoke out. The war created a rift between Rose and Graham. She became firmly convinced that it was a terrible mistake for the US to join the war, and she traveled the country speaking against it. He was so enthusiastic about the war that he enlisted and went into uniform. He was too old to be sent overseas, but for several years was in uniform in the New York National Guard, although he never came closer to combat than marching in parades like this one, going down Fifth Avenue. But by this point, their marriage was on the rocks. They remained together for 7 more years, but very uneasily because they were going very different directions in politics. Rose joined the Communist Party and actually in 1922 went to Russia as an American delegate to a meeting of the Communist International. And like far too many people, she thought that in Russia she had found paradise. Graham looked for paradise in a different direction. He abandoned all his involvement in progressive politics and became deeply interested in religion, particularly in blending the traditions of Christianity and Hinduism. In 1925, they got divorced very bitterly, and that put them back on the front pages one last time. As soon as they were no longer a couple, the press lost interest. After the divorce, Rose, as a matter of principle, refused to accept any alimony, and she was reduced to poverty again. Soon she came down with cancer, and she died at the age of 53 in 1933. Graham lived on to the age of 88, dying in 1960. So that's their story, or a very short version of it. I wish I could say they changed the world. They didn't, but perhaps through their eyes we can see a world that needed changing and that still does today. So if you have questions or comments, Monika, you should fire away, and I think there's a way for people to send in their questions in a way that you'll see.
I have so many questions, Adam, and thank you so much for this whirlwind tour of the story. I can tell all of you watching that this is just the smallest of tastes of a really amazing story that actually makes wonderful quarantine reading. In part because I'll just start with the relationship advice part, Adam. In part because there's a real love story here between two people who, over time, discovered that their love for each other was strong, but also that they were much more different even than they had thought. And that's an experience that a lot of people are having who are spending 24/7 together now. So I'm curious what was going on in their relationship that made it work as long as it did, and what made it finally not work?
Well, one of the most fascinating things for me about working on this material and writing this book is that they left an immense store of material. Usually it's very hard to get inside somebody else's marriage, especially a marriage that's very far in the past. People are no longer alive. You can't interview them. But they saved, it seems to me, every letter they ever wrote, literally thousands of them, to each other, to other people. They saved letters they wrote when they were deeply in love, letters that are furious when they were getting divorced. Rose kept a diary for a while. They wrote dueling unpublished memoirs. Rose's was finally published about 50 years after she died. And then a lot of these remarkable people that they knew wrote their recollections of them. So we really have quite a lot of material to work from and to get inside that marriage with. And by the way, it's a lesson to everybody who's listening. Please keep diaries, save your letters, leave something for historians to work with. What I see when I go through that material is you can see what attracted each of them to the other. Graham Stokes grew up in a pretty stuffy world. And I think when he met this vibrant young newspaper reporter who was tremendously excited to be in New York, which was a far larger world than anything that she'd ever lived in, he felt here was somebody who was fresh, open, excited about the possibilities in life, and somehow was unlike anybody he had ever met before in his 30 plus years. So far as we know, he never had any strong romantic interest in any other woman before her. For Rose, here was a guy who was tall, handsome. She wrote that he looked like Abraham Lincoln, certainly in height he did. And he had a wide acquaintance with many of the most interesting writers and intellectuals of the day. She looked up to him. She thought this was somebody she could learn from. Here was somebody, she had never had more than 2 years of formal schooling. He had multiple graduate degrees. So I think she thought of, here's somebody that she can learn from. I think they both, going into it, especially Graham, had a fairly traditional idea of marriage. They may have been socialists, but I think their view of marriage was one where they expected the man would take the lead and the woman would follow. It took Rose, 8 or 10 years to fully outgrow that and to realize, I think, that she was a lot smarter than her husband, despite his multiple graduate degrees. It became clear immediately that she was a far better public speaker than he was. And so it was her talks that began getting attention. And this was one thing that I think fed the rift between them. And they had very different instincts politically, especially after they parted ways on the First World War. Rose had this tremendous faith, misplaced, I think, in the Soviet Union. Graham had an equally misplaced faith that he could find himself in the US military. So you can sort of see them going their separate ways at that point and trace the growing rift between them in the letters that they left behind.
Noted. I will not toss my diary.
Good.
There are already lots of really great questions coming in, and I think I'll just weave them in as the opportunity arises. One is about whether they had children, and not only did they not, but there's an interesting reason for why, because Rose was also an advocate of contraception.
Yeah.
And another viewer asks, was she a proponent of eugenics, which ties very much into that debate at the time.
No, she was definitely not a proponent of eugenics, although the unpleasant uncle who was the hotel owner was a big enthusiast for that movement. They didn't have children and apparently didn't want to. We know that simply because Rose was a very active campaigner in the birth control movement at a time, of course, when it was against the law to talk in public about birth control, and even more so to pass out information and birth control devices and so on. But when she did this, she said, I've used birth control myself. So it appears to be they didn't want children. I think one reason for this was that Rose had 6 younger siblings. She'd grown up in a house where much of the time there wasn't quite enough to eat for everybody. 2 of her younger siblings had to be placed out in foster care because they just couldn't care for them at home. And so she had enough children in her house, in her life already, and some of them spent considerable time living with Graham and Rose in their home. So I think they felt there was enough kids in their life already and they didn't want more.
another, this is fascinating how women of that time, when there wasn't a lot of opportunity for women to define a leadership role for themselves, how they would have to invent the persona that, a persona that could convey leadership and authority. You mentioned that Rose met Mary Harris Jones, Mother Jones, who is the namesake of the magazine that you helped found and that I work at. And so I can't help asking, there's an element to the biography of Mary Harris Jones where she really had to invent a public persona for herself. How did that work for Rose Pastor Stokes? How did she create her image?
I don't think there was as much of one as Mary Harris Jones did, because Mother Jones really went with the image of the grandmother, the feisty gray-haired old lady who had, seen several and raised several generations of kids and knew what's what and wanted her wishes obeyed. Rose was different. I wouldn't say that there was an particular image she cultivated, but she did pay a lot of attention to how what she said was reported. If she felt a newspaper reporter got something wrong, she wrote a letter to the editor. If it was a wire service story that appeared in several papers, she wrote, several or many letters to the editor. She was very good at dealing with the press. She knew that reporters love to overhear dialogue. It gives them something to write about. And so when a reporter in St. Louis came to interview her over breakfast at her hotel, she engaged the waiter in conversation and asked if he belonged to a union, and he did. So that was part of the reporter's story. She allowed reporters into their home to show that she was trying to live modestly and not in the kind of style that Graham's parents did, and that she did her own cooking, and they saw the pots and pans she used and so on. So she paid attention to how she was portrayed, but I wouldn't say there was a particular image that she cultivated.
Viewer asks in a related vein, did she end up finding herself as a result of the differences between the two of them? Was that part of how she learned who she really was?
I think so. I think, as I said, she went into this marriage thinking that here was somebody she was going to learn from and meet his exciting friends and be happily in his shadow. And then she began to discover, and this came fairly soon after they married, that when they appeared on the speaker's platform, the two of them went around doing a lot of speaking together, and they also went around together campaigning for socialist candidates. She was the one that people wanted to listen to, and she could electrify crowds. And he stumbled and bumbled along and hemmed and hawed, and apparently was a terrible speaker. And my one regret is that this was just a decade or so too early for there to be audio and video that I could actually watch and listen to. But there are many accounts of her speeches, and there are transcripts of a few of them. And you can see why she was such a good speaker. And she writes about the process in her memoir. She never spoke from a text, never spoke from notes, adjusted what she said to her audience. So if she was speaking to an audience of labor unionists, whether on strike or not, she talked about her dozen years in the cigar factories and what she'd learned there and what that was like doing cigar work. And it was miserable work, by the way, because you're breathing tobacco dust all the time, and cigar workers had the second highest rate of tuberculosis of any occupation in the United States. If she talked to a middle-class audience, a women's club or something, she knew how to bring alive things like the miserable conditions in the New York tenements. If she talked to a religious audience, she spoke in terms of Bible stories. So she had a knack for how to reach people.
You're really describing a journalist too, someone who was really focused on her audience and on storytelling. And one of the things that I really loved about the book was the way that newspapers are almost a third character in the story. Maybe in part because there was no television and no radio. Did you find, and this was also a time of great attacks on the press. Did you find that there were any echoes of this to the moment that we're living in today?
Well, the media scene is completely different today, of course. It's a joy in writing about a period like, 1900 to 1920, which most of the book takes place, that if you want to know what happened at a particular meeting in New York, say, New York had something like 8 or 9 daily newspapers at that point. And you can easily find copies of most of them online these days. So you can get 8 or 9 different views of an important meeting. That's wonderful. And that's just, the daily newspapers in English. There were, in addition, a huge array of newspapers in other languages because we had such a large immigrant population. The Socialist Party had its own newspapers. Rose wrote for one of them, the Evening Call in New York, which was a daily. Other political parties and radical groups and so forth had their newspapers. So there's a rich array of printed material to work from. Today, of course, our print newspaper press is sadly shrunken. Rare is the city, I don't think there are more than 1 or 2 anymore, that have more than 1 daily newspaper. And some of those daily newspapers are just shells or shadows of what they once were because, of course, all the advertising has gone to the internet. But I do think there is a wealth of other kinds of media today that didn't reach, such a wide audience back then. And that a magazine like Mother Jones, a website like The Intercept, of course, Mother Jones has its own website as well, reach enormous numbers of people with alternative points of view to what they would find in the daily press.
A viewer is asking about John Reid and noting that both John Reid and Emma Goldman went to Russia to support the revolution, but really grew disillusioned. And they are curious where Rose in particular landed on this.
Rose was friends with both of them, and she was in particular an admirer of Goldman, who I think was something of a model for her of how to be a politically engaged woman who was a writer, who was a speaker, who was right in the forefront of all the big political battles of the day. Yes, John Reid and Emma Goldman both did go to Russia. Reid several times, and he wrote the classic book, 10 Days That Shook the World, his eyewitness account of the Russian Revolution. And he died in Russia of typhoid in 1920. And there's argument about whether or not he began to get disillusioned before his death. We don't really know. There isn't solid evidence on that. Emma Goldman arrived in Russia in 1920, had a meeting with Reid, which I would have loved to have overheard, lived in Russia for 2 years, had the advantage of speaking Russian because she had grown up in Russia, and came away deeply disillusioned because she was smart enough to see that, this was a country that had turned into something really quite murderous. She retained her radical principles. She campaigned for social justice for the rest of her life, although as an exile from the United States. She supported the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War, but she lost all her illusions about the Soviet Union after spending 2 years living there. Rose, unfortunately, was quite angry with her for that and never really forgave her and regarded her as a traitor to the revolutionary cause. A real pity, I think, because I think Goldman was the one who was right in that situation.
Several viewers are curious about Rose's relationship with Judaism. Did she convert? How did she feel about religion?
You know, it was not a big part of her life. The only reference in her memoir to ever being inside a synagogue is the one that she remembered from her early childhood in Russia. Once she was in the United States, she did visit synagogues, but as a speaker. Uh, During the couple of years that she worked for the Yiddisches Tageblatt, the newspaper in New York, uh, this, by the way, was the more conservative of the two major Jewish newspapers. It was really the voice of Orthodox Judaism in the United States. One of the things she did was an advice column for women, and she advised them to be dutiful about going to the synagogue on Saturdays and on the high holy days, and to sit in the balcony, which is the sort of separate place for women in some Orthodox synagogues. But there's no evidence of any kind that she ever did that herself. I think she was really not that interested in Judaism per se, even though until she came to New York, and even her first 6 months in New York, living on the Lower East Side and working at the newspaper, she lived in an almost entirely Jewish world.
Immigration is really a theme in this book, and it's one of the things that make it so eerily resonant of this present moment. The sort of rampant inequality that you have, the attacks on the press in the second decade of the century, the populist and white supremacist strain in political discourse. I wonder if, did you know when you embarked on this book that you had found a time that was even more Trumpian than this moment we're living in?
I didn't realize it to that extent, and I got fascinated by it because you see so many of the same dark currents running through American life that, have boiled up to the surface today. This tremendous hostility towards immigrants. The focus was different then because there were not a large number of people trying to get here from Latin America, as is the case today. The focus back then, the anti-immigrant feeling came from primarily from white Americans who had been here by 1900 for several generations. Their ancestry was usually English or German, and they were alarmed at the large number of people from Italy, from Greece, and especially the Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe who began immigrating to the United States in large numbers after about 1890. And this was what lay behind the eugenics movement. It was what lay behind the push for toughening the immigration laws, which happened in 1924 when extremely restrictive immigration laws were put in, where it limited, there were quotas given for different countries, but the quotas were based not on the population of the United States as it was at that time in 1924, but as it had been in 1890, when there was a far greater proportion of people coming from Northwestern Europe, England, Scotland, Germany, and so on, than from Russia, Eastern Europe, and Italy. So yeah, that current was a very strong one, and it runs through that period. And of course, as I say, it's boiling up again today with somewhat different targets.
The Cinderella story is so much a story about overcoming inequality on a personal level, and what one of the things that's so interesting about Rose and Graham is that they also try to overcome it on a larger societal level. There are a few different viewers who are interested in why we are not learning more about that and about really the history of the fight against inequality in the United States.
Well, this also is a theme that's very much with us today. No matter how you measure it, the share of national wealth and income held by the top 1% today, or by the top 0.1%, or by the top 0.01% compared to everybody else is higher. There's a greater disparity today than there was when Rose and Graham got married in 1905. So we have become steadily, well, not steadily because things got a little better during the New Deal in the 1950s and 1960s, but we are a more unequal country today than we were at the time that this story takes place. And I think when that happens, you can think about it in either of two different ways. You can look for magical solutions, Cinderella solutions. Prince Charming comes along, brings Cinderella to the castle. And this is the kind of thing that makes us so fascinated, so many people so fascinated with commoners who marry into the British royal family, for example, Harry and Meghan, and William and Kate, people whose status rose through this magical marriage. But magical solutions won't take you very far because there aren't enough mates for Cinderellas to go around. And I think that's the rising inequality is certainly something that has fueled a great rise in people wanting to do something about it. Look at the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. Look at the number of people who supported also Elizabeth Warren saying very similar things in the presidential primaries. This was something that, was people talking about issues of economic justice in this way was something that wasn't happening to this extent 10, 15 years ago in this country. But as things get worse and more extreme, I think many more Americans are open to those kinds of ideas.
There's a really fun anecdote in the book where Rose tries to, I think she tries to persuade a strikebreaker that it's really in her best interest to join the union. And the strikebreaker has a pretty on the nose response to her.
Yeah, the strikebreaker, the Rose said, there's no future for you unless you join the union. She was, out there on the picket line trying to persuade a woman not to cross it. And the woman said, well, I could always marry a rich guy and my life would be much better. So, yeah.
And you say in the book, this is one of the few arguments Rose ever lost. There's some interest from the viewers about how she became this incredible orator and writer, speaker, storyteller, despite having, I think you said, 2 years of formal schooling total?
Well, one of the things you realize when you look at the United States as it was 100, 120 years ago, was that there were a lot of people who wrote, who were eloquent speakers, but who'd had very little schooling. Look at the Wobblies, the IWW. I mentioned, in my slideshow, Big Bill Haywood, who could recite long passages of Shakespeare by heart. I mean, he never had much more schooling than that. He certainly never went to college. I'm not even sure if he finished high school. But people read books back then. People read books in large quantities. Every Wobbly office had a big library. When there were more than 100 Wobblies in jail in Chicago in 1919, they had a library of books with them that their supporters had donated. And actually, when they were on trial that year, the prosecutor in this big trial, trying to embarrass them, was asking somebody about the library they had in the jail and asked rather contemptuously, are there any books in the library written by Wobblies themselves? And one guy said, well, I don't know if Victor Hugo or not was a member of our union or not. I never did see him down at the Union Hall, just to indicate what kind of books he was reading. So I think today we sort of assume too much of a connection between being able to read thoughtfully, write articulately, speak eloquently, and having a higher education. It's not always necessary. And I think it was often not the case at that time when actually only a very small percentage of people had finished college, and a far smaller percentage of women had finished college or even gone to college in the first place.
There are a few people asking about the later years of Rose's life and whether she reconsidered any of what she was thinking. And I also wonder if, without, totally spoiling the end of her story, you could give us a little bit of a sense of her life post-Graham.
Well, they got divorced in 1925. And as I say, very bitterly exchanged angry letters, and it was all over the newspapers again. And then a curious thing happened. Rose, who was always sort of thoughtful and self-reflective, wrote a letter to her best friend, a novelist, Olive Tilford Dargan, and said, the strangest thing has happened to me. From the moment I left Graham, I've had no more desire to speak in public, to campaign politically, to do any of these things which have been her life for the last 20 years. And she never talked about it again, but I think she was sort of saying that part of what had been fueling her, at least in the last few years, had been the sense that her speaking out politically in a way that disagreed with him enraged her husband. Now he was no longer her husband. She'd sort of lost the desire to do that. She did not live long after they divorced, only 8 years. She was sick much of that time, trying to deal with her cancer. And before that happened, she started doing art. She had some drawings exhibited. She wrote poetry, but she virtually stopped her political activism, although she never resigned from the Communist Party. She wrote to the head of the party and said, "Comrade, I'm not going to be active for a while." So I don't think she reconsidered that allegiance. Would have been nice if she had and had made a political journey like her one-time friend Emma Goldman. But when you're writing history, you can't always control what people do.
A viewer is commenting that maybe in the age of online learning, people might likewise be able to become highly literate without picking up books, or actually, she said, by reading books, which is exactly the note that we want to strike here, because just as a reminder, Adam's book is truly fascinating, and you can find it at Seminary Co-op, which is semcoop.com. I'm going to use moderator's privilege, and even though we're at time, ask you one more question that was very much on my mind in reading the book, which is, you get this sense of an era that has some really ugly politics, and with activists, I'm sure sometimes feeling as if they were tilting at windmills in trying to create a more just and equitable society. And yet, America came out of that moment eventually, and things changed quite significantly. So for this present moment, what do can we derive any hope from that?
Well, I think we can take hope from this. Sometimes when good things happen, the seeds of them have been planted a long time before. To my mind, a lot of good things began to happen in this country in the 1930s. We got Social Security for the first time. We got greatly improved workmen's compensation, unemployment insurance, things like that. But these were things that American socialists and other radicals, including non-socialist radicals like the Henry George single taxers and progressives and other people, had been talking about 30 and 40 years earlier. So not much was done back then, but some of their ideas finally were put into place in the 1930s. I think that's the way the politics of social change are. You never win a battle quickly. It always takes much longer than you think it's going to. You know, I think we are still working off the after effects of slavery in this country. But it's a journey. There are steps on the road, and you get closer and closer to a goal, but it takes time.
Couldn't dream of a better note to end on. Thank you so much, Adam, for sharing this extraordinary story and for taking the time today.
Well, thank you, Monika, and thanks to the Chicago Humanities Festival.
And thanks to all of you who joined us live. Go buy Adam's book and enjoy it and find hope in it. Bye-bye.